In the summer of 2019, I embarked on a solo hiking expedition in the remote valleys of Gilgit-Baltistan, Pakistan. At 28, I considered myself an experienced trekker, having traversed various terrains across the country. This time, I aimed to explore the lesser-known trails of the Karakoram Range, seeking solitude and the thrill of uncharted paths. My journey began in the small village of Hush, a gateway to several challenging treks. Equipped with essential gear, maps, and a week's supply of food, I planned a circular route that would take me through the Gondogoro La Pass and back. The locals warned me about unpredictable weather and advised against solo trekking, but I was determined. The initial days were serene. The trail meandered through lush meadows, glacial streams, and towering peaks. The air was crisp, and the only sounds were the crunch of my boots and the occasional chirping of birds. Each night, I camped under a canopy of stars, feeling a profound connection with nature. On the fourth day, as I approached the Gondogoro La Pass, the weather took a sudden turn. Dark clouds gathered, and a cold wind swept through the valley. I decided to set up camp earlier than planned, hoping the storm would pass by morning. Throughout the night, heavy snowfall blanketed the landscape, and temperatures plummeted. By dawn, visibility was minimal. The trail markers were obscured, and the once familiar path was now a uniform expanse of white. Relying on my compass and map, I attempted to navigate, but the risk of avalanches and hidden crevasses made progress perilous. After hours of trudging, I realized I was disoriented and possibly off course. As the day wore on, fatigue set in. My limbs were numb, and each step became a struggle. I found a sheltered spot behind a rocky outcrop and decided to wait for better conditions. Rationing my supplies, I hoped for a break in the weather. However, the storm persisted for 2 more days. 5 scary hiking stories, creepy tales from real hikers, https://outdoordept.com/scary-hiking-stories/question_source=chatgpt.com. On the 7th day, with food dwindling and no sign of improvement, I made the difficult decision to descend, hoping to find a lower altitude and perhaps encounter other trekkers or locals. Navigating through the snow-covered terrain, I slipped and injured my ankle. The pain was intense, but adrenaline pushed me forward. By evening, I stumbled upon a shepherd's hut, abandoned but offering shelter. Inside, I found remnants of firewood and managed to start a small fire. The warmth was a relief, and for the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of hope. The next morning, I was awakened by voices outside. A group of local shepherds had returned to the hut. They were surprised to find me but quickly offered assistance. They treated my injury and provided food. Over the next few days, they guided me back to Hush. The villagers welcomed me warmly, and I was taken to a local clinic for proper medical attention. Reflecting on the ordeal, I realized the importance of heeding local advice and the unpredictability of nature. The experience, though harrowing, reinforced my respect for the mountains and the resilience of the human spirit. It was the middle of autumn when I decided to take a solo hiking trip. I was 32 years old, living in Portland, Oregon, and I had a few days off from work. The kind of break where I didn't have any plans and no obligations, just a free stretch of time ahead. I'd been on hikes before, but this one was different. Something about the rugged trail, the isolation, and the allure of the forest called me in a way I couldn't ignore. I had picked a trail that wasn't particularly well known, a small loop called Eagle Creek Trail, just outside of the Columbia River Gorge. The area was known for its sharp cliffs and dense forest, a sharp contrast to the busy city life I had been living. I figured it would be the perfect spot to clear my head. The day was cool but sunny when I set out. The early morning light filtered through the trees in golden beams, and I could feel the crisp air on my skin. The trail was well marked at the start, but as I moved further in, the crowd thinned. Soon, I was walking alone, the only sounds being the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of birds. It was peaceful, almost too quiet. I'd brought my backpack with all the essentials: water, a few snacks, a map, and a small first aid kit. I also had a light jacket in case the weather turned, but nothing too heavy. I didn't want to be weighed down. The whole point of this trip was to be free and light, to get away from the daily grind and reconnect with nature. The further I went, the more the trail twisted and turned through dense trees. I noticed that the ground beneath my boots became uneven, with loose rocks and roots making each step a little more cautious. There was a faint smell of damp earth in the air, and the trail began to ascend gradually as I moved into the deeper parts of the forest. About 2 hours in, I took a break by a stream. The sound of rushing water was oddly soothing, and I decided to sit down for a while, pulling out a granola bar and sipping some water. As I sat there, I realized that I hadn't passed anyone in the last hour. The quiet felt heavier now, almost like something was waiting. I shrugged it off, finishing my snack and checking my map to make sure I was still on the right track. The trail seemed to widen here, but it didn't last long before it narrowed again, winding up the side of a steep hill. I could feel my heart rate quicken as I climbed, the incline getting more challenging. By the time I reached the top, I was breathing heavily, but I didn't mind. It felt good to push myself. From the top of the hill, the view was breathtaking. I could see the valley below, the river winding its way through the forest. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the landscape. I stood there for a few minutes, taking in the silence and the beauty of the surroundings. It was everything I had hoped for, a moment of stillness, where nothing mattered but the present. But then something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, or maybe a deer or some other animal, but I wasn't sure. There, across the valley, at the edge of the forest, I saw movement. It was quick, too quick for a deer, and I felt an odd chill run through me. My heart skipped a beat. I took out my phone to take a picture, just to calm my nerves, but the camera didn't seem to focus right. The screen was fuzzy, as if the lens was fogged up, though it wasn't. I wiped it, then tried again. Still nothing clear. The movement across the valley had stopped. I told myself it was nothing, a bird, maybe, or the wind, making the trees move in a way that looked strange from a distance. But my instincts told me to be cautious. I packed up my things quickly and started back down the hill, not wanting to linger longer than necessary. That's when I noticed the first sign that something was off. As I made my way back toward the trail, the sounds of the forest seemed to change. The birds had stopped calling, and the usual rustle of leaves underfoot felt muffled. I could hear my own breath, and the pounding of my heartbeat seemed louder than before. It was as if the forest itself had gone quiet, listening. I shook it off, blaming the isolation. After all, it was just me out here, and I was probably overthinking things. But when I reached the bottom of the hill and began walking along the creek again, I realized that the path seemed wrong. The markers on the trees that had once been so clear were now harder to spot. The trail that I'd followed up seemed to have changed, as if the path had split off without me noticing. I stopped and pulled out my map, scanning it for any sign of where I was. But the map didn't match what I was seeing. The trail I was on didn't look right. The creek, which I had followed earlier, was running in the wrong direction now. My stomach tightened. The sense of unease I'd felt earlier was now growing, gnawing at the back of my mind. I wasn't lost, I told myself. I just missed a turn. I retraced my steps, trying to ignore the rising panic in my chest. But the more I walked, the more the trail seemed unfamiliar. I checked the time. It was nearing 4:30 p.m., and the sun was beginning to dip lower, casting long shadows. The last thing I wanted was to be out here after dark, especially with how quickly the temperature dropped in the fall. I kept walking, scanning the trees for any sign of the familiar markers. But the deeper I went, the more the trail felt wrong. My sense of direction seemed to be failing me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Then I heard it, a snap just ahead of me. It was too loud to be a small animal. I froze, holding my breath, and listened. Nothing. I forced myself to keep moving. The sound could have been anything, but something deep inside me urged me to hurry. I picked up my pace, trying not to panic, but every step seemed to take me further from the trail I remembered. That's when I saw it. A figure, just off the trail. It was standing still, partially obscured by the trees. The figure didn't move at first, and I thought for a moment it was just another hiker. But then I noticed the lack of movement, the way it stood too still, as though waiting for something. Couldn't make out any details. No backpack, no clear clothing. Just the shape of a person standing there. I looked around, but there was no sign of anyone else. The path had narrowed again, and the trees were closing in, their twisted branches overhead blocking out the light. I should have turned back then, but something kept me going, a stubbornness I couldn't shake. I had to be close to the trailhead, just a little further. But as I passed the spot where I'd seen the figure, I realized it was gone, vanished. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. That was when the silence returned. The birds, the rustling leaves, everything that had made this forest feel alive had disappeared. My breath came in short gasps now. My mind raced, but I didn't know what to do. It was like the forest had swallowed any trace of humanity, and I was alone, hopelessly lost. I reached for my phone, but there was no signal. Of course, there wasn't. There hadn't been for hours. At that point, the dread took over. My heart was racing, and I couldn't stop moving. I pushed myself forward, not caring about the path anymore. I just wanted to get out, to find something that felt familiar. And then I saw it, the trailhead, barely visible through the trees, the sign marking the end of the trail. It was so close now, and I nearly collapsed with relief. But when I reached the edge of the forest and stepped into the clearing, I realized something even more terrifying. There were no cars, no hikers. The parking lot was empty, and the once busy trail was silent. My truck was still there, parked in the same spot I had left it. I climbed into it, hands shaking as I started the engine. As I pulled away, my eyes kept scanning the trees, half expecting to see someone, or something, lurking just out of sight. But there was nothing. The woods were just that, woods, empty and silent, waiting for the next person to wander in, only to realize that the forest doesn't give up its secrets so easily. When I got home that night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I don't know if I'll ever go back to that trail. Maybe the forest isn't as empty as it seems. I never thought I'd find myself here, on this trail, in this place. It had started out as a spur-of-the-moment decision, something to break the monotony of my regular life. I'm Lucas, 33 years old, working in a cramped office that had the same dull view every day. Sometimes I needed to get out, to breathe fresh air, to escape the noise. That's when I decided to do something different. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want the pressure. Just me and the mountains. It was a Saturday when I set off. The sky was clear, and the sun was just warm enough to make the early morning feel pleasant. The plan was simple. Take the trail up to Pine Ridge, about a 5-hour hike, and camp out for the night. I'd done a few hikes before, but nothing too strenuous. I had a good sense of direction, a decent level of fitness, and a small but sturdy backpack filled with the essentials: water, snacks, a small first aid kit, and a tent. I didn't expect any trouble, just a peaceful day on the trails. The trailhead was quiet when I arrived. It was still early enough that there weren't any other cars in the parking lot, and I liked that. I didn't want crowds, didn't want people intruding on my solitude. The map at the entrance showed a well-maintained trail that wound through dense woods before eventually reaching a clearing at the top of Pine Ridge, where I'd set up camp. The first part of the hike was smooth. The path was wide, and the trees surrounding it were tall and thick, blocking the sunlight in spots and leaving the ground dappled with shadows. The air was crisp and smelled faintly of pine, fresh and clean. My boots crunched softly on the gravel and dirt underfoot as I moved along, the only sound aside from the occasional call of a bird. I settled into a rhythm, one foot in front of the other, enjoying the quiet solitude. No rush, no deadlines, no stress. By mid-morning, the forest had grown denser, and the trail had narrowed. There was no one else around, which I found somewhat comforting. This was what I wanted: the stillness of the woods, the peace. The deeper I went, the less I thought about anything else. But then, something started to change. It was subtle at first. At first, I thought I was just imagining it. The trail became steeper, more uneven. with large rocks poking through the soil, making the hike more strenuous. The trees seemed to close in tighter, their trunks gnarled and twisted, their branches reaching out like fingers. The sun was less present now, its light muted by the canopy above. The air felt heavier too, as if the forest itself was breathing with me. I stopped for a moment, pulled out my water bottle, and drank, wiping my brow. I checked the map again, but I was still on the right track. No wrong turns. I looked around and noticed that the birds' calls had stopped. I felt an odd sense of unease, like I was being watched, but I brushed it off. It was probably just the isolation playing tricks on me. I continued up the path, and soon, I entered a stretch where the forest seemed to grow quieter still. The breeze stopped moving, and the trees weren't as dense anymore. There was a sudden openness to the landscape, and I found myself walking through an area with tall grasses that swayed gently, almost unnaturally. The ground beneath me felt different too, soft and spongy, like the earth hadn't seen sunlight in ages. At this point, I noticed something strange. There were signs of something else moving around. Tracks, barely noticeable at first, appeared in the soft earth beside the trail, imperfectly shaped prints, the kind that could be left behind by something large and heavy, but not quite identifiable. They weren't animal tracks. I had seen my share of deer, coyotes, and other wildlife on hikes before. These tracks didn't match any of them. It was then that I started to feel the first inkling of discomfort. Something wasn't right, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I paused again, scanned the area, but saw nothing. The silence was oppressive, almost suffocating. The trail began to climb more sharply, and the once clear path had turned into a tangled mess of roots, rocks, and underbrush. I had to step carefully to avoid tripping. I didn't mind, it made the hike more interesting, but that nagging feeling of unease kept growing. I wanted to turn around, but I had already come so far. Pine Ridge was just a few more miles ahead. I told myself it would be fine. A little discomfort was normal in the wilderness. But as I continued, the woods seemed to grow even thicker, and I could sense something else. The air felt heavy, as if something was pushing in on me. I could hear my breath, steady but slightly quicker now, and the sound of my boots crunching on the uneven ground felt too loud in the eerie stillness. I thought I saw movement in the trees, a flicker of something between the trunks, but every time I looked directly at it, nothing was there. My mind was playing tricks, I thought. Nothing more. I reached a clearing after what felt like an eternity. The sun was low in the sky now, casting long shadows across the uneven terrain. I checked the time and saw that it was almost 4 in the afternoon, just a couple more hours before the light would begin to fade completely. It was time to find a spot to camp, and I wasn't sure I wanted to go any farther anyway. Something in my gut told me to stop. The clearing was small, with a flat area that seemed perfect for setting up my tent. I quickly gathered firewood, set up the tent, and started a small campfire. As the fire crackled to life, I felt a slight sense of relief. The warmth was soothing, and the sounds of the forest, distant rustling and chirping, felt more familiar now. But as the night crept in, that feeling of being watched returned. I tried to shake it off, but it was there, like an invisible weight pressing down on me. I wasn't used to this. I had camped plenty of times, and never had I felt this sense of unease, this irrational fear. The firelight flickered, casting strange shadows around the clearing. Every crackle of the fire seemed too loud in the deepening silence of the forest. I tried to eat something, but my stomach wasn't cooperating. My appetite had vanished. I didn't sleep much that night. The sounds of the forest had become sharper, more distinct. Each rustle, each crack, each snap of a twig was amplified in the darkness. I lay in my tent, my eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling of the nylon shelter. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something that didn't belong. The next morning, I was exhausted. I hadn't slept a wink. As the first light of dawn filtered into the clearing, I packed up my gear, eager to leave. My plan had been to hike to the top of Pine Ridge, but now all I wanted was to get back to the trailhead. I broke camp quickly and started back down the trail. The hike down was far more difficult than it should have been. The once familiar path seemed unfamiliar, twisted, like it had changed overnight. I couldn't shake the sensation that I was going the wrong way. I checked my map again, but everything was supposed to be right. And then I heard it, a noise behind me, a footstep, a branch snapping. I spun around, heart pounding in my chest, but there was nothing there. The trail was empty, the woods still, but the feeling that I was being watched, grew stronger, more persistent. I walked faster, my eyes darting to the trees, scanning for anything that might be hiding in the shadows. The path seemed to stretch on endlessly, the dense woods pressing in closer and closer. I had never been so aware of every sound, every movement. The next few hours were a blur. My mind was racing, my body tense, my steps hurried. The forest seemed to close in on me, the trees too close, the shadows too dark. Every step felt like it was being watched. Every turn seemed wrong. When I finally reached the trailhead, the sun was beginning to dip low in the sky again. I could see my car in the distance, the familiar sight of it a strange comfort after the tension of the woods. I couldn't leave fast enough. I got in the car, slammed the door, and started the engine. I didn't look back. As I drove away, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Maybe it was just my imagination. Too much time alone in the woods, too much isolation. But deep down, I knew something had been wrong out there. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I wasn't just imagining it. I didn't go hiking again for a long time after that. And when I did, I chose a completely different trail in a completely different place. I had always been an avid hiker, and the idea of spending a day lost in nature, away from the busy hum of city life, felt like the perfect escape. It was early October, a chilly Saturday morning, and I had decided to take a trip out to the Pine Ridge National Forest. I'd heard about the trail from an old friend who had hiked it a few times, though she had warned me that it was a bit rugged in parts. But I was used to rough terrain, and the promise of a quiet day among towering trees and the scent of pine made it all the more tempting. I was 32, fit enough to handle a long hike, and accustomed to being out in nature. The forest was about an hour's drive from my home, a small town called Elmswood. The sun had barely risen when I left, so the roads were mostly empty. The ride gave me time to think, to reflect on the past few months of my life. It had been stressful, with work piling up and personal things weighing heavily on my mind. It seemed like a good time to just disconnect for a while. Arriving at the trailhead, I parked my car in a gravel lot. There were no other vehicles around, which felt odd but also perfect. I was hoping for solitude, a peaceful day where I didn't have to talk to anyone. The forest stretched out in front of me, with thick trees towering overhead. The ground was soft with fallen needles, and the air smelled earthy, fresh, and cold. I checked my gear quickly. A small pack with water, snacks, a first aid kit, and a map of the trail. I had researched it thoroughly the night before, noting down landmarks and any potential hazards. The trail was marked well, at least in the beginning, and it was a loop about 12 miles according to the map. I estimated it would take me a good 6 hours to complete, depending on the terrain. I was in no rush. The first part of the hike was easy enough. The path was wide and clear, leading gently uphill through the dense forest. The trail wound between towering oaks, maples, and pines. The leaves were turning, some tinged with yellow and orange, others still green. A few squirrels darted across my path, and a bird call echoed through the trees. I slowed my pace, taking in the calm surroundings, feeling the stress of city life melting away. But as I continued, the trail began to narrow. The path became less distinct, and the ground beneath my feet grew more uneven. Small rocks and tree roots snaked across the trail, making every step a little more challenging. I slowed down, being careful to watch my footing. The forest around me thickened, and the air grew cooler. By noon, I had reached a section of the trail that seemed to fade into the wilderness. The markers were spaced farther apart, and I was relying more on my map than the trail signs. I checked the map, noting that I was nearing a stream that would take me to the halfway point of the loop. The stream, according to the map, was only a mile ahead. I could hear the faint sound of rushing water as I pressed on. It was then that I noticed something strange. The sounds of the forest seemed to fade. The birds had stopped singing, and the rustling of leaves in the wind had quieted. I paused, taking a deep breath, wondering if it was just my imagination, but it felt off. A chill ran down my spine. Shaking off the unease, I pressed on, pushing myself up a small incline. The ground was steep here, and I had to scramble up a bit, using my hands to steady myself. When I reached the top, I could see the stream below, a narrow ribbon of water winding through the trees. It looked serene, inviting. I decided to take a break there, sitting on a flat rock near the water's edge, pulling out my water bottle and some trail mix. As I sat there, I noticed something strange. The air felt heavier, almost oppressive. The quiet was unsettling, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I stood up quickly, scanning the trees around me, but saw nothing. There were no animals, no birds, no movement at all. I could hear the faint sound of water, but that was it. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the feeling. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe the isolation was getting to me. I had been hiking for hours, and I was starting to feel the effects of the climb. I needed to keep going. I crossed the stream carefully, following the narrow path on the other side. The trail was more challenging now, weaving through thick underbrush and over rocks. The trees grew taller here, their branches creating a canopy overhead that blocked out much of the light. The forest felt darker, more enclosed. After a while, I noticed something else. The trail seemed to be veering off course. I pulled out the map, trying to orient myself. I had been following the trail markers, but now they seemed to be leading me in a different direction. I retraced my steps for a few minutes, trying to find where I might have gone wrong. It didn't make sense. The trail was supposed to be a loop, and I should have been nearing the halfway point. But now it felt like I was deeper in the woods, farther from the main trail. I stopped, unsure of what to do. The quiet was becoming more pronounced, and my sense of unease was growing. The idea of turning back seemed logical, but I didn't want to lose time retracing my steps. I glanced at the map again, but the landmarks weren't matching up with the terrain around me. The forest was starting to feel unfamiliar, and I realized that I might have taken a wrong turn somewhere. The thought of being lost in this vast forest didn't sit well with me, but I pushed it aside, telling myself that I could figure it out. Minutes stretched into hours, and as the day wore on, I began to feel the weight of my situation. I hadn't seen a single other hiker for hours, and the trail markers had become increasingly rare. It was then that I heard something, a faint crack of a branch snapping behind me. I froze. My heart rate spiked, but I told myself it was just an animal. Maybe a deer or a bear. I looked around, my eyes scanning the dense trees, but saw nothing. The forest was still as death, the quiet unnerving. I pushed forward again, my pace quickening. I needed to get out of there. The next stretch of the hike was the hardest yet. The trail became even more overgrown, the ground uneven and slippery from the damp underbrush. I had to move carefully, taking each step with caution. As I neared another stream, I saw something unusual on the ground, something large and dark. At first, I thought it was a log, but then I saw the pattern on it. It was a shoe. My heart skipped a beat. I approached cautiously, and as I got closer, I realized it was a hiking boot, one that looked well worn, almost abandoned. There were no other signs of the person who had left it behind. No other clothing or gear, just the boot, half buried in the leaves. My mind raced, but I couldn't make sense of it. Who would leave a boot out here? The uneasy feeling returned with full force. I needed to move. I couldn't stay in this area any longer. I pushed myself to keep going, trying to shake off the dread that was creeping up on me. The trail was now barely visible, and I had to use the trees as markers to stay on course. By now, the sky had started to darken. The sun was setting quickly, and I had no choice but to find shelter for the night. I wasn't prepared for an overnight stay. My pack only had enough for the day, and I had no tent or sleeping bag. I found a small clearing between a couple of large trees and decided to make camp there. I gathered some dry leaves and branches, trying to make a small shelter with what I had. As the night fell completely, the forest became even more oppressive. Every rustle in the leaves, every snap of a twig, made my heart race. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there, watching me. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off to sleep in my makeshift shelter, despite my fear. It was mid-September, the air crisp and the skies clear. I had decided to take a solo hiking trip through the Sierra Nevada mountains. I had always loved the outdoors, the feeling of being immersed in nature, and the peace it brought. This would be my first solo trip in a while, and the thought of being alone on the trails excited me. I planned for weeks, studied maps, checked weather forecasts, and packed carefully. My backpack was full of food, water, a first aid kit, a sleeping bag, and a map that would guide me along the trail. I wasn't a beginner. I had hiked these mountains before, though always with a group. This time, it would be just me and the wilderness. I parked my truck at the trailhead just before sunrise. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a few cars parked beside the trail, belonging to other early risers. I hoisted my backpack onto my shoulders, adjusted the straps, and felt the weight settle comfortably on my back. It was an overcast morning, but there was a sense of calm, a serenity that made me feel grounded. The trailhead sign marked the beginning of the Sierra Crest Trail, a well-known route among hikers. As I stepped onto the trail, the sound of crunching gravel beneath my boots was the only thing that filled the air. I inhaled deeply, filling my lungs with the cool mountain air. The trees surrounding the trail were tall and thick, their leaves rustling with the gentle breeze. I was used to the quiet of the mountains, but today, it felt even more isolating. I had no companions, no distractions. Just me, the trail, and the sounds of nature. The path was well-defined at first, winding through the pines, and I quickly settled into a steady rhythm, my legs moving easily, my breathing even. It wasn't long before I left the familiar trail behind, the sounds of civilization fading with each step I took. My surroundings were shifting. The trees grew taller, denser, and the air cooler. I checked my watch. It was nearly 9 a.m. The solitude felt good, but I couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease creeping up on me. Something about the silence, the stillness of everything around me, made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I brushed it off. It was just the quiet of the mountains, I told myself. It was normal. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Hours passed as I continued up the trail, the landscape gradually changing. The pines gave way to scattered scrub and alpine meadows. I could feel the altitude gaining on me, and my breathing grew slightly heavier, though I didn't mind. The higher I climbed, the more isolated I felt. There were no signs of other hikers, no voices, no other footsteps, just me alone with my thoughts and the mountain. By mid-afternoon, I reached a ridge that overlooked a valley below. It was breathtaking. Craggy cliffs, vast stretches of wilderness, and peaks that pierced the sky. I stopped for a break, took out some snacks, and drank from my water bottle. The view was everything I had hoped for, peaceful and uninterrupted. I pulled out my map to check my route. According to the map, I was nearing the spot where I planned to set up camp for the night. I glanced around, realizing that I had not seen a single hiker in hours. That was strange. The trail was popular. There were usually a few others out here. The thought briefly crossed my mind that I was completely alone, but I pushed it aside. The idea that something could go wrong on a trail like this seemed far-fetched. It wasn't until I started descending into the valley that I began to sense that something was off. The trail narrowed, and the trees thickened, casting deep shadows on the path. The usual chirping of birds had quieted. Even the wind had died down. Everything was eerily still. I quickened my pace, hoping to reach my camp spot soon. Just as I was about to cross a small creek, I heard a noise, distant at first, like the snap of a twig underfoot. I froze, listening intently. There was no wind, no rustling of leaves, just absolute silence. The noise came again, closer this time. A sharp crack, followed by the distinct sound of something heavy shifting in the brush. My heart rate quickened. Could have been a deer, I reasoned, or perhaps just a squirrel. But as I looked around, I felt the weight of the silence pressing in on me, as though the woods were holding their breath. I forced myself to move forward, though my instincts screamed at me to turn back. The trail began to slope downward, and I found myself entering a small, secluded valley. The trees were thick here, their trunks twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching overhead like clawed hands. The ground was uneven, the underbrush thick, making every step feel labored. I checked my watch again. It was almost 5 p.m. I still had time to set up camp before dark, but something in my gut told me I shouldn't linger here. The uneasy feeling only intensified as I continued forward. A few minutes later, I found the perfect spot. A small clearing near a large rock outcrop with a clear view of the sky. I could see the dark clouds rolling in, and I knew I'd need to set up camp quickly if I wanted to avoid getting soaked. I dropped my backpack and set to work, unpacking my tent and sleeping bag. As I worked, I kept glancing around, feeling the odd sensation that I wasn't alone. My ears strained for any sign of movement, but all I could hear was the soft rustling of leaves. The sky had darkened significantly, and I hastened my pace. Once the tent was up, I stashed my gear inside and quickly gathered wood for a fire. The ground was damp, and I knew a fire would be essential for warmth and light through the night. I managed to get the fire started with some difficulty, the dry kindling catching slowly at first. But once the flames were going, they quickly spread, casting a warm, flickering glow in the clearing. As night fell, the temperature dropped, and the shadows deepened around me. I sat near the fire, pulling my jacket tighter around me. The crackling of the flames was comforting, but the oppressive silence around me was unsettling. I stared into the fire, watching the orange flames dance and sway. The feeling of being watched had only grown stronger. I shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what was bothering me. It was then that I heard the sound again, the snapping of twigs, the rustling of leaves. My heart skipped a beat. It was closer now, almost right behind me. I quickly stood, grabbing the knife I had in my pack. The sound stopped. I turned in a circle, eyes scanning the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just trees, shadows. My breath came in short, sharp gasps. It had to be an animal. But why did it feel so deliberate? As though whatever it was knew I was here. I spent the rest of the night on edge, the fire flickering low. I kept the knife close, my mind racing with all sorts of possibilities. Most of them unlikely, but the paranoia crept in. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to lay down in the tent. The darkness outside seemed to press in on me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every small sound sent me into alert mode. The night passed in restless fits of sleep, interrupted by every creak, crack, and snap in the woods. When dawn finally broke, I packed up my gear as quickly as possible. The fire was long gone, just a few smoldering embers left in the ashes. The sky was overcast, and the mist hung thick in the valley, making everything look even more desolate. I left my campsite without looking back, following the trail toward the ridge. The further I got from the valley, the more my unease faded. By the time I reached the top of the ridge, where I had originally planned to set up camp, I felt safe again. The sun broke through the clouds, and I stood there for a moment, taking in the vast expanse of wilderness before me. As I retraced my steps back to the trailhead, I passed the spot where I'd set up camp the previous night. My eyes lingered on the clearing for a moment. Something about it felt wrong, as though the woods had been holding a secret, something I wasn't meant to know. But I was safe now, and I'd made it out without incident. The hike back down was uneventful, and as I approached my truck, the sense of relief washed over me. I was tired, dirty, and hungry, but I was alive. As I drove away from the trailhead, I couldn't shake the thought that whatever had been out there, whatever had been watching me, was still out there, waiting for the next unsuspecting hiker. I was 31 the summer I decided to take a long solo hiking trip through a stretch of national forest in northern Vermont. This was in 2016. I had just quit a job I hated and moved out of an apartment I had rented with a girlfriend who I'd been with for 5 years before we ended things for good. We were done. No drama, just a slow death that felt like it had taken years. I packed up a few bags, drove my car across the state line from New York, and stayed at a cheap motel near a trailhead I had looked up months ago. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for. I just wanted to walk into the woods and stay there for a few days, maybe a week. I needed silence and space, and I figured walking alone through trees and up hills might be the only thing that made me feel normal again. I had camped before, hiked a lot with my brother growing up, and even did some solo stuff here and there, but this time was different. I wanted to be out of range. No service, no towns nearby, just me, a pack, and the trail. I brought enough food for 5 days and had a small water filter kit, first aid, rain gear, and all the basics packed down tight. I signed in at the ranger station the morning I left and told them I'd be back in about a week, depending on weather. I planned to do a big loop using a mix of marked and lesser-used trails through a section of the Green Mountain National Forest. It wasn't remote enough to be dangerous, but it was far enough off the beaten path that I could go hours without seeing another person. The first day was easy. A few miles of gradual incline, just dense forest on both sides, the smell of pine and soil, sun cutting through the canopy. I hiked past a few small creeks, filtered water once, and found a good spot to make camp right before sundown. I had brought a lightweight one-person tent and a small camping mat, nothing fancy. The night was quiet except for a few owls and a raccoon that circled my campsite for a while. I heard it sniffing and rustling a few times, but I kept everything sealed and it eventually lost interest. The second day, I started to feel more alone. The trail got narrower and more rugged. I stopped seeing any kind of trail markers and had to rely more on the map and compass I brought. My phone was already useless, no bars, no GPS. I didn't care. I felt free. Just me and the sound of my boots on the trail, birds calling, wind pushing through the tops of tall trees. I ate energy bars and trail mix for lunch near a small pond and pushed on for another 6 or 7 miles before stopping. That night it rained hard, and I stayed curled in my tent listening to it pound the nylon above me, the smell of wet earth soaking through the zipper seams. By the third day, something changed. I woke up with a sore back and realized I'd set my tent on a slope the night before without realizing it. My sleeping pad had slowly slid downhill through the night, and I spent most of it curled at a weird angle. It wasn't a huge deal, but my legs were stiff. I stretched and ate a small breakfast bar while looking over the map. My plan was to take a side trail that would cut across a higher ridge and drop down into a valley before connecting back to the main loop. It looked doable, but I knew it would be a lot more isolated. I started hiking early, around 6:45 in the morning, with fog still sitting low on the forest floor. The side trail was barely there. A faint break in the underbrush and a few old trail markers nailed to trees that had faded almost completely. After about a mile, those markers disappeared entirely. I kept checking my compass and map, making sure I was still headed in the right direction. The climb was steep, steeper than it had looked on the topo map. I was drenched in sweat by 10 a.m. My shirt stuck to my back, and I started rationing water even though I hadn't found a stream since the day before. Somewhere around noon, I reached the ridge. The view was amazing, tree-covered hills rolling out in every direction, the clouds clearing just enough for the sun to break through in streaks. I sat down on a rock ledge and ate a peanut butter sandwich. My shirt was soaked. My socks were starting to chafe, but I felt okay. That feeling lasted maybe another 2 hours. I started my descent into the valley around 2 p.m. It wasn't a marked trail anymore. It was more like a game trail, barely visible, just packed dirt winding through thick brush and steep drops. I slipped once and caught myself on a root. Another time I slid a few feet and tore a hole in the knee of my pants. By the time I reached the valley floor, my legs were trembling. The air down there was dense and still, almost too still. There were no sounds, no birds, no bugs, just silence, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I didn't like it. I started looking for a campsite, but the ground was uneven and soggy. It must have been a floodplain during heavy rain. I walked along what I thought was a dry creek bed, trying to find solid ground. That's when I spotted the ravine. It wasn't marked on the map. At first, I thought it was just a dried-out gully, maybe erosion from an old seasonal stream, but as I followed it with my eyes, I realized it dropped steeply into a narrow cut between two ridges. The trees around it were different too, older, taller, and spaced weirdly apart. I should have turned around. That part's clear now. I should have just gone back to the ridge and found a different way around. But I didn't. I was tired, a little disoriented, and figured if I could follow the ravine downhill, it might lead to water or a clearer route. I dropped into it around 4 p.m. The sun was already dipping low behind the ridge, so shadows stretched long through the trees. The walls of the ravine were steep on both sides, maybe 10 to 15 feet high in some places, covered in thick roots and moss. I walked the center, which was mostly dry, crunching on dead leaves and small stones. After about a quarter mile, it got narrower. The walls tightened, and I had to walk sideways in some spots. I slipped on a patch of wet mud and banged my elbow on a rock. When I got up, I noticed something strange. There were drag marks in the mud. Not tire marks or boot prints, but long, deep lines like something had been pulled through. I froze. They weren't fresh. The edges were dry and cracked, maybe days old. But they weren't made by an animal. They were too straight, too heavy looking. I told myself it was probably a fallen tree that had slid down during rain. Still, I felt that pressure in my chest. That kind of tightening that happens when your body knows something before your mind does. I kept walking. I passed an old tarp about 10 minutes later, just a corner of it poking out from under a pile of wet leaves and sticks. It was shredded, sun-bleached, and clearly abandoned for a long time. It looked like someone had tried to cover something with it. I didn't check. I didn't want to. I just kept going. By then, it was getting dark. I should have turned back, climbed out of the ravine, and found high ground, but the walls had gotten steeper, and I wasn't sure I could make it back up without slipping. I figured if I just followed it far enough, it would open up or flatten out. I was wrong. It got worse. The ravine curved sharply and then widened again. The ground leveled out just enough for me to see that it ended in a dead drop, at least 20 feet down into a kind of rock basin full of thick mud and debris. Like everything from upstream had been funneled there. I stood at the edge, sweating, heart pounding. There were broken branches, bits of clothing, and what looked like an old hiking pack half buried in the muck below. I couldn't make out anything else, but I didn't want to look harder. I turned around and started back the way I came. Climbing out wasn't easy. I had to dig my boots into the soft sides, grabbing roots and rocks, pulling myself up hand over hand. I slipped twice and nearly fell back into the ravine. When I finally reached the top, it was almost completely dark. I didn't even bother finding a good camp spot. I just picked a patch of flat dirt, threw my tent up, and crawled inside. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound outside made my heart jump. Branches cracking, something moving through the brush. I didn't use a flashlight. I didn't want to see anything. I just lay there, clutching my small utility knife and waiting for the sun. When morning came, I packed up fast and started hiking uphill, back toward the ridge. I didn't eat. I didn't drink. I just moved. I knew I had gone off the map and needed to get back to a marked trail. I spent that whole day hiking with no breaks, legs burning, boots soaked, only stopping to filter water from a stream I finally found late in the afternoon. By nightfall, I reached the edge of a marked trail again, an old forestry road. It wasn't on my original route, but I didn't care. I followed it for 2 more days until I reached a ranger station on the opposite side of the forest. The ranger looked surprised when I came in. He said no one usually came out from that direction. I just nodded. I signed out, walked to the nearest town, and called a shuttle to take me back to where I'd left my car. I never reported what I saw: the tarp, the drag marks, the pack at the bottom of the ravine. I didn't want to be the guy starting stories about missing hikers. I didn't want to be asked why I went in that deep alone. I just wanted to forget it. I still go hiking, still love the woods, but I don't go off-trail anymore. I don't follow unmarked paths or game trails or dry creek beds. And if I ever see something that doesn't look right, a shape in the mud, a tarp where it shouldn't be, I was in my late 20s when I decided to tackle the hiking trail up to the Old Bear Pass. It wasn't a popular trail by any means, mostly because of its rough terrain, lack of well-marked paths, and its history of being a place where hikers had gone missing. Most people chose the more accessible, tourist-friendly trails that cut through the national park, with their clear signs and gentle slopes. But I had a different idea. It was early October, the kind of weather where you could feel the crispness of fall in the air, and the leaves were turning into a mix of vibrant oranges and reds. The days were still warm, but the mornings had that chill that made you zip up your jacket without thinking. I was staying at a small cabin on the edge of a forest, a place I had rented for a weekend alone to disconnect from the hustle of everyday life. That morning, I packed my backpack with essentials: water, a couple of protein bars, my camera, and a spare jacket. I checked my gear, making sure I had my map and compass, even though I had been hiking for years and didn't need to rely on these tools as much. The trailhead was a bit off the beaten path, and I was the only one there when I arrived, which only added to the eerie feeling that had begun to creep into my mind. I tried to shake it off as excitement for the adventure ahead. The beginning of the trail was lined with thick trees that created a canopy above, filtering the sunlight into dappled patches on the ground. The dirt path was uneven and steep, but I didn't mind. I welcomed the challenge. The quietness of the forest around me was almost suffocating, though it wasn't the usual peace of nature that made me feel calm. Instead, it felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As I ascended, the trail started to narrow, and the incline became steeper. The deeper I went into the woods, the more isolated I felt. It wasn't long before the sounds of the world outside the forest began to fade away completely. There were no distant road noises, no airplane hums, nothing. Just the occasional rustle of leaves underfoot and the soft chirping of birds. But something about it felt off, almost too quiet. Around midday, I reached a small clearing and stopped to take a break. I leaned against a large boulder, unzipping my pack to pull out a granola bar. The sun was now directly overhead, warming my skin, and I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the rays hit my face. When I opened them again, I noticed something strange. A footprint. It wasn't large, but it was distinct, shaped like a heavy boot. It wasn't deep enough to be a fresh print, but the ground here was soft and damp, so it caught my attention. I looked around, scanning the trees and underbrush, but there was nothing. The trail I had just come from seemed empty, untouched. I shook it off, convincing myself it was probably just another hiker or someone who had been up here recently. The trail was known to be lightly trafficked, and it wasn't uncommon for the occasional lone hiker to wander off the main paths. But as I continued, the unsettling feeling grew stronger. Every so often, I felt like I was being watched, and the hairs on the back of my neck would stand up. I'd turn quickly, expecting to see someone behind me, but no one was there. By late afternoon, the trail became even more difficult, winding its way through thick underbrush and the occasional rocky outcrop. The trees grew taller and denser, casting long shadows on the path. My legs were beginning to feel the strain, but I pressed on, determined to reach the pass by nightfall. I had no real reason to hurry, but something inside me urged me forward, as though time was running out. I had just crossed a small stream when I heard a rustling noise to my right. I froze, my heart racing. The sound was faint but distinct, a brush of leaves, followed by the snap of a twig. I turned quickly, my breath shallow, but there was nothing there. Not a single movement in the trees or underbrush. I convinced myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something harmless, but the noise had been too deliberate, too close for comfort. I decided to keep moving, telling myself I was being paranoid. But then, as I moved forward, the same noise came again, but this time closer. I spun around, my heart in my throat, and I saw nothing. I reached for my knife, which I kept in a sheath at my side, though I wasn't sure why. There was no reason to believe I was in immediate danger, but my instincts were screaming at me. I tried to calm myself, taking deep breaths, but it didn't help. I looked down at my feet, trying to focus on the trail in front of me, but the feeling of being watched didn't subside. The forest was still. Not a bird chirped, not a leaf rustled. The shadows began to stretch longer, and I realized I was nearing the top. The path began to flatten out, and I could see the vast expanse of the valley below, the mountains rising in the distance. But just as I reached the ridge, I heard it again, the sound of footsteps behind me. My heart nearly stopped. I spun around, but no one was there, just the endless trees. I took another deep breath, trying to steady myself, but that's when I noticed it, the faint smell of smoke. It wasn't the usual smell of wood burning, more like something that had been smoldering for a while. I knew there was no camping allowed up here, not near the pass. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was probably just a distant wildfire, but the smell was growing stronger, and it didn't sit right with me. I stood still, scanning the area around me. The forest was still silent. I couldn't hear any movement, couldn't see any signs of life. But then, through the trees, I saw something, a faint flicker of movement. Someone was out there. My blood ran cold. I took a few steps back, my hand gripping the knife tighter, though I knew it wouldn't help much. My eyes locked on the spot where I had seen the movement, but there was nothing now. The trees were still. I stood frozen for a long moment, my breath shallow, my mind racing. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't far. I could feel it. I backed away slowly, my eyes darting between the trees. I moved quickly, silently, trying to retrace my steps. But every time I thought I was making progress, I'd hear that rustling again, the sound of movement coming from behind me. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned around and ran. The trail was uneven, and I stumbled several times, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound of footsteps behind me never stopped, never slowed. They were growing louder, closer. Then, just as I thought I couldn't go on any longer, I stumbled into a small clearing. There, in the middle of the clearing, was a campfire. The smoke was thick and pungent, and I could see the outline of a man sitting beside it. He was hunched over, his face hidden by the shadows, but I could tell he was staring directly at me. I froze, my legs trembling. The fire crackled, but the man didn't move. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, and then, just as I thought the worst was about to happen, he stood up slowly and turned away, disappearing into the trees without a word. I didn't wait to find out what he was doing, or if he'd return. I turned and sprinted back down the trail, my legs burning, my lungs aching. I didn't stop running until I reached the edge of the forest, the trailhead, and the safety of the open road. I didn't know who that man was or what his intentions were, but I wasn't about to find out. As soon as I reached my cabin, I packed my things and left. I didn't care that it was late. I didn't care about anything except getting far, far away from that trail. And to this day, I still don't know who or what I encountered up there. But one thing is certain: some places are best left untouched. I've been planning this hike for months. The trail had always fascinated me. Tucked away in the Rocky Hills near a quiet town called Pine Ridge, somewhere up north. I had read about it on a couple of hiking forums, and it seemed like the perfect challenge. Not too many people took the hike because of the rough terrain, and I figured I'd be able to clear my mind with a good solo trip. It was a crisp morning in mid-September when I arrived at the trailhead. The parking lot was almost empty, just a couple of cars parked at the far end. I could see the first section of the trail stretching out before me, winding through dense woods. The sun was barely up, but it was enough to light up the path. I had my pack ready, just the essentials: water, some snacks, a map of the area, my phone, in case of emergencies, a compass, and a small first aid kit. I wasn't expecting anything too extreme, but I knew to be prepared. I checked my watch. It was 7:30 a.m. The air was cool, and there was a slight breeze that rustled the leaves overhead. There was no one around, and the silence felt oddly peaceful, though it did make the woods seem more alive in a way. I began walking, the sound of my boots crunching against the gravel path as I started my journey. First, the trail was easy. It was well marked and followed along the edge of a stream. The water babbled gently, and the trees, mostly pines, stood tall on either side, their branches swaying in the breeze. I walked for about an hour, taking my time, not rushing. The sun started to climb higher, and soon the light filtered through the trees in patches, casting long shadows across the trail. As I hiked, I could feel the quiet of the woods. It wasn't like the usual trails I'd been on. This one felt more secluded, like it had its own rhythm. The sounds were different too. There were no birds calling from the treetops, no rustling of animals through the underbrush, just the occasional gust of wind and the steady sound of my footsteps. It was around 9 a.m. when I first noticed something odd. I had been on the trail for a couple of hours now, and as I rounded a bend in the path, I saw a pile of rocks stacked precariously on top of each other. It wasn't an official marker. It didn't match the way the trail had been marked before. It looked like someone had built it, but why? There was no sign of any other hikers, and the trail was still completely quiet. I paused for a moment, staring at the rocks. It didn't feel threatening, but it was out of place. Shrugging it off, I continued on. There were plenty of possible explanations. Maybe someone had done it as a marker for themselves, or maybe it was just an odd coincidence. Either way, it didn't really matter, so I moved on. The trail began to steepen after that, winding through a series of switchbacks that led up into a dense thicket. The trees grew thicker here, their branches twisting and turning, almost like they were reaching out for me. The sun had begun to feel warmer now, but the air was still crisp enough to keep me comfortable. I noticed how much quieter the woods had become. No more wind, no birds, nothing. I felt it then. Something wasn't right. I tried to shake off the feeling. It wasn't uncommon to feel a bit uneasy when you're alone in the woods for a long stretch. But this was different. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something felt off. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was oppressive. My mind raced with thoughts of what could be causing the change in atmosphere. Maybe it was just me being paranoid. Maybe I was imagining things, but there was no denying it. I was now hyper-aware of every single sound around me. Every creak of a branch, every footstep, every distant snap of a twig. I pushed forward, trying to focus on the trail and ignore the feeling gnawing at me. But it didn't go away. I came across another odd sight just after noon. The path led me to a small clearing where the trees opened up briefly. There, in the middle of the clearing, was an old, half-buried wooden crate. It looked ancient, the wood weathered and cracked, its hinges rusted. I wasn't sure if it had been left here deliberately or if it had simply been forgotten by time. Curiosity tugged at me. I was alone, and it didn't seem like anyone had passed this way for a while, but I hesitated. After a few moments, I decided to take a quick look. I knelt beside the crate and pried it open with my hands. Inside, there was nothing but a few scattered rocks and pieces of wood. No treasure, no gear, no sign of anything useful. It felt like it had been left there long ago, maybe just for someone to stumble upon it. Or maybe someone had left it behind in case they needed it later. Either way, I wasn't sure what to make of it. The unsettling feeling came back stronger now. It wasn't just the crate, though. It was everything. The air was still, and even the distant sound of the stream seemed to fade. I stood up, brushing the dirt from my hands, and glanced around. There were no other hikers, no signs of anyone else being here. It felt like I was the only one on this entire trail. And the longer I stayed in this eerie silence, the more I began to question my decision to come here alone. I continued onward, but now my pace quickened. I didn't want to stop. Not here, not in this place. Every step felt heavier. Every turn of the path seemed to lead to another stretch of silence. The woods were getting darker now, and the sun was hidden behind thick clouds, adding to the heaviness of the atmosphere. By the time I reached the next bend in the trail, the sky had turned a deep gray, and I could feel the weight of the storm that was slowly rolling in. I looked up at the sky, gauging how much longer I had before the rain would hit. It didn't look good. The storm was coming fast. I pushed myself to move faster, but the trail had begun to narrow, and the rocks underfoot grew uneven. I couldn't keep up the pace I wanted. Every step seemed more difficult, as if the trail itself was trying to slow me down. The air felt thick now, charged with the coming storm. I had to find shelter soon or risk getting soaked. Suddenly, a crack of thunder echoed through the trees, startling me. I didn't waste any time. I picked up my pace, trying to find a place to take cover. That's when I noticed it. From the corner of my eye, I caught movement. Someone was standing in the trees just off the trail. I froze. The person didn't move. They stood perfectly still, hidden in the shadows of the forest. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew I had to move quickly. I turned around and began to run. I had always wanted to hike the Wild Pine Ridge Trail. The mountain had a reputation for being tough but rewarding, and I was craving that sense of accomplishment. I was 28, not too young but not too old either, and I had been hiking for years. Most of my hikes were simple, nothing too intense. But the Wild Pine Ridge was different. It stretched over 30 miles, crossing dense woods, rugged rocks, and steep inclines. The thought of a challenge appealed to me. It was early October when I set out. The trees were already turning gold and orange, the weather crisp but not cold. I had everything packed: tent, sleeping bag, stove, water, food, and the usual hiking gear. I didn't need much. I knew how to read a map and follow the trail markers, so I wasn't worried. The trailhead was just off the old highway, a spot you could only find if you really looked for it. The parking lot was small, just a few vehicles when I pulled up around 7 a.m. The sky still dim with dawn. I started up the trail around 7:30, feeling the familiar rush of excitement and that sense of solitude that comes with being in nature. The trail began as a gentle slope, but it didn't take long before it started to climb. The trees closed in around me, their thick trunks towering overhead, the ground beneath me littered with fallen leaves and branches. The air smelled fresh of pine and earth. I paused now and then to take in the view, the valley below, the way the sunlight cut through the trees, casting long shadows. There was something peaceful about it. By mid-morning, I was already high up the ridge. The trail was narrower, winding through dense thickets of pine and spruce. I hadn't seen anyone for hours, and that suited me just fine. The silence was thick, except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the call of a bird far off in the distance. The higher I climbed, the steeper it became. My legs burned, but I was used to it. I kept a steady pace, pausing only to sip water or take a bite of a granola bar. Around noon, I came to a part of the trail that was particularly steep. The ground was loose and gravelly, and the rocks were slick. I had to concentrate, placing each foot carefully. The wind had picked up, and I could feel the chill cutting through my jacket. It wasn't unbearable, but it reminded me that I was getting high up into the mountain now, where the elements could turn harsh quickly. Then, just as I was reaching a narrow ridge, I noticed something strange. A faint scent in the air, a sharp, almost metallic smell. It was strange. I stopped and sniffed, trying to figure it out, but it didn't smell like something familiar. Blood? No, something like blood, but not quite. My mind raced through possibilities, but nothing made sense. It was so faint that I thought maybe I imagined it. I continued on, my curiosity piqued. The trail dipped slightly, and I followed it, my attention divided between the trail ahead and the odd scent that lingered in the air. It was growing stronger, but still faint. I didn't know why I didn't turn around then. Maybe I thought it was just my imagination, or maybe I was so focused on getting to the summit that I didn't want to stop. It wasn't long before I came across something that made my heart skip a beat. A shoe. Not just any shoe. This one was scuffed and muddy, with the laces dangling loosely. It was odd to see it there, alone, abandoned in the middle of the trail. I bent down and picked it up, noticing how it was worn, the tread nearly gone. There was a faint mark on the heel, a smear of something dark. The scent of metal hit me harder now, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. This wasn't right. I looked around, but the forest was quiet. No signs of anyone else, no other tracks, no voices in the distance. The trail was still as deserted as it had been for hours. I considered the possibility that someone had simply lost the shoe. But then why hadn't they come back for it? And what was that dark smear? I dropped the shoe back onto the ground and kept moving. My heart rate picked up as I continued up the trail. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I didn't want to admit it. I was on my own, and I didn't want to let a little paranoia get the best of me. The rest of the afternoon passed slowly. The trail got steeper, and I found myself taking more frequent breaks to rest my legs. The sense of isolation settled around me like a heavy fog. I stopped noticing the beautiful views or the sounds of nature. My mind kept drifting back to the shoe, the strange, unsettling smell in the air, and that nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. By the time I reached the summit, the sun was beginning to set, casting the sky in hues of pink and purple. I set up my camp just off the trail, away from the ridge to get some shelter from the wind. My hands were shaking more than I cared to admit as I worked. It wasn't cold yet, but the air had that sharp bite to it, the kind that promised a drop in temperature overnight. I cooked my dinner, a freeze-dried meal I had brought with me, and sat down to eat. But the whole time, I couldn't get the image of the abandoned shoe out of my mind. Kept looping through my thoughts, along with that strange smell. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized I hadn't seen a single other person on the trail all day. Not a soul. The parking lot had been empty when I arrived, and now here I was, miles from civilization with no one around. I finished eating, packed away the rest of my gear, and crawled into my tent for the night. The wind howled outside, making the tent flap wildly, but I didn't sleep well. Every noise, every shift of the wind, every rustle of leaves outside made me jump. I kept my flashlight on, shining it toward the entrance of the tent, not wanting to be caught off guard. The hours dragged on, but eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a sound. It was faint, but unmistakable footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and getting closer. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The wind outside had stopped, and for a moment, all I could hear was the rhythmic crunch of footsteps on the trail. They were coming from the direction I had come from earlier. I held my breath, straining to hear more, but the sound stopped just as suddenly as it had started. I lay still, listening for any other movement. The footsteps hadn't been loud, but they were real. Someone or something was out there. The fear surged through me, sharp and overwhelming. My mind raced through all the possible explanations. A hiker? Maybe. But who would be hiking in the middle of the night on a trail like this? And why hadn't I heard them before? I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The darkness was complete. There was nothing. The moon had slipped behind a cloud, and the woods were swallowed up by blackness. The trail was empty, but the smell was back, stronger now, like iron mixed with earth. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I hadn't imagined it. It was real. I didn't want to stay another second. I quickly packed my gear, trying not to make too much noise. Every rustle of fabric felt deafening in the silence. I grabbed my backpack and made for the trail, heading back down the way I'd come. I didn't know what I was running from, but I knew I had to leave, fast. It wasn't until I reached the clearing where I had found the shoe that I saw it. Something moving in the shadows. A figure, tall and hunched. I couldn't make out any details, but I saw enough to know that it wasn't a hiker. I ran. I didn't look back. My heart pounded, and my legs burned as I pushed myself harder. The trail seemed endless, but I didn't stop. I didn't care how far I had to go, as long as I got away from whatever that was. When I finally reached the parking lot, I didn't stop. I didn't even look to see if my car was still there. I just jumped in, slammed the door shut, and sped off into the night, never looking back. I was 29 years old when I decided to take on the hike of a lifetime. It wasn't a big name trail or something with fancy guided tours. It was just me, the wilderness, and the idea of pushing myself further than I had ever gone before. It was early September, and the mountains in Colorado were starting to cool off. The crispness in the air just enough to remind me that autumn was approaching. I had done my research, studied maps, and even talked to a few locals about the area. They all seemed to dismiss it as just another trail. A walk in the woods, nothing to be afraid of. But I should have known better. Nothing is ever that simple. I set off early, just as the first rays of sunlight hit the peaks. The trail I had chosen wasn't popular, but it wasn't exactly off the grid either. There were a few posts online, but I could tell that the people who hiked it didn't care to share much. It was just a place to lose yourself for a few days. The first few hours went by without much incident. The trees were thick, and the path was muddy from the rain earlier in the week. The sky was that perfect shade of blue, the kind that makes you think nothing could go wrong. Birds chirped overhead, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush was just another animal going about its business. I was alone, but it didn't feel isolating. It felt peaceful. I reached the first landmark on the map around mid-morning, a large rock formation that jutted out over a cliff, offering a view of the valley below. The wind picked up as I stood there, the cool gusts sending a chill down my spine. I took a few pictures, mostly for memories, though I knew I'd never really look at them again. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. It was one of those moments when you get a gut feeling that there's something just out of place, but you can't put your finger on it. I shrugged it off, as I often did with these types of thoughts, and continued down the path. The trail began to narrow as I moved deeper into the woods. The trees grew taller, their branches heavy with pine needles. The air felt damp, and the smell of wet earth clung to everything. I found myself slowing down, my footfalls quieter, as if I was trying to sneak through someone else's territory. The world around me felt heavier, as though the weight of the forest was pressing in on me. By early afternoon, I had left the main trail behind, following a smaller, less obvious path. I had seen some notes online about this trail leading to a small stream, where many hikers stopped to camp for the night. I was planning on doing the same, but as I ventured further, I noticed that the trail wasn't as well worn as the others I had seen. The dirt was softer, the bushes more overgrown, and there were fewer signs of life. I was still confident in my decision, though. Felt like an adventure. Then, around 3 p.m., things started to change. I reached a small clearing that was supposed to be the campsite. I dropped my pack and took a deep breath, taking in the silence. It was unnerving. There was no sound of wind, no birds, no rustling in the trees. It felt like I had stepped into a pocket of stillness that was completely detached from the rest of the world. Even the air felt off, like it was just a little too thick. But it was a perfect spot for camping, so I decided to settle in. I set up my tent and gathered some firewood. As I worked, I couldn't help but glance around every so often. It felt like eyes were on me, but I quickly dismissed the thought. After all, I was just in the woods. Animals were everywhere. Maybe it was just a bear or a deer watching from the trees. Nothing to be afraid of. The fire I built crackled and popped as I sat down to eat, my thoughts drifting. The sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the clearing. The temperature dropped, and I pulled my jacket tighter around myself. I hadn't planned on staying the night, but the feeling of isolation had begun to set in, and I found myself unsure whether I wanted to be alone in the dark. The night deepened quickly, and I decided to turn in early. There was no reason to push myself any further. I was tired, and the trail had taken more out of me than I had anticipated. But as I lay there in my sleeping bag, trying to sleep, I began to hear things. First, I thought it was just the wind again. The trees creaked in the distance, and the sound of leaves shifting on the forest floor was constant. But then, I heard something that didn't feel right. A branch snapping, not from the wind, but from something heavy. Something moving through the woods. I held my breath and listened. The sounds were too rhythmic, too deliberate. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a deer or a bear. Whatever it was moving on 2 legs. Slowly at first, then faster, as if it was circling the clearing. I sat up in my tent, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind raced through every possible explanation. A lost hiker? Someone out here just like me? But then I realized that this trail wasn't well known. It wasn't the type of place where people went off track. I hadn't passed a single soul all day. I had seen no signs of other hikers. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't supposed to be. The sounds grew louder, closer. I grabbed my flashlight and poked my head out of the tent. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. The presence. It was out there, just beyond the edge of the light. I didn't know what to do. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get out of the woods. But where would I go? The nearest trail was miles away, and it was already dark. I spent the next few hours in that same spot, frozen. The sounds didn't stop. They never stopped. They circled me all night long. When the sun finally started to rise, the sounds vanished, leaving behind only the birds and the wind. I didn't sleep at all that night. I packed up my things quickly, eager to get moving, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me. As I left the clearing, I felt the weight of the forest pressing in on me again. Only this time it felt different. This wasn't a peaceful place. There was something in these woods that didn't want me there. The hike back was a blur. My legs were sore, and my mind raced with the sounds of the night. What had been out there? Why hadn't I seen anything? I kept expecting to hear footsteps or something crashing through the woods behind me, but nothing came. It was as if whatever had been out there was gone. But I knew that wasn't the case. It was still there, somewhere. When I finally reached the trailhead, I was relieved but also strangely unsettled. I had made it out, but I wasn't sure if I would ever really be able to leave those woods behind. My name is Darren Foley. Back in 2012, I was 31 years old and living alone in a small town called Palouse in eastern Washington. I worked from home doing freelance design work, which gave me a lot of flexibility with my time. I wasn't much of a social person back then. I liked quiet. I liked being away from noise and people. So I hiked a lot. I'd usually stick to well-known routes in Idaho or the Cascades, but that summer I started getting interested in old or less traveled trails. Places where you could walk a whole day and not see anyone else. I liked that kind of silence. I told myself it gave me space to think, to breathe properly. But sometimes, I think I was chasing something I couldn't explain. Maybe I liked not being found. That's how I ended up planning a solo hike on a poorly maintained Forest Service trail out in Northeast Oregon, way past Joseph, out near the Eagle Cap Wilderness, but not inside the protected area. I had found an old forestry map online showing a faint, winding trail through a place called Murphy Ridge. Not many photos existed, but one guy's blog from 2009 said it was tough, unkempt, but wildly beautiful and worth the sweat. That sounded good to me. I printed the map, marked the approximate route, packed food for 3 days, and drove down in early September, before the first snows hit the higher elevations. It took nearly 7 hours to reach the forest road that would take me up to the trailhead. The last hour was gravel, narrow, with potholes and tight switchbacks. My old silver Subaru Outback could barely handle it. There were times I had to stop and get out, move rocks, or check that I wasn't about to high-center the undercarriage. When I finally arrived at what I guessed was the start of the trail, just a small clearing with a faded wooden sign lying on the ground, I was already tired from driving and frustrated with the rough road. But it was quiet, completely still. No wind, no bugs, no birds. Just late afternoon sunlight coming in through the lodgepole pines. I remember thinking, this is what I came for. I changed into my hiking boots, shouldered my 40-pound pack, and locked the car. I hadn't seen another person since the last gas station 2 hours back. The first hour was steep, mostly climbing through dense pine forest with the occasional switchback. The trail was there, technically, but it hadn't been maintained in years. Logs were down across it in a dozen places, and overgrown brush clawed at my legs. I had to scramble over fallen trunks, duck under branches, and use my trekking poles to test the dirt in places that looked unstable. Still, I was in good shape. I made progress. Around 6, I came across a dry creek bed that cut across the trail. It had steep, eroded banks and some old animal tracks in the dust. I paused there, checked the map, ate some jerky, and drank half a liter of water. I figured I'd go another mile and camp for the night. That would put me just under halfway to the ridge. I hiked until the light faded out around 7:30. I found a small flat area beside a rock outcrop that looked safe, pitched my tent, and ate a cold meal. As I lay there in the tent that night, the stillness felt absolute. I didn't hear anything. No rustle of branches, no insects, no distant animals. felt like the world had been paused. But I told myself that was just elevation and isolation. My GPS showed I was about 6,400 feet up. I set my bare canister away from camp, made sure everything was buttoned down, and drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I started early. The trail ahead was worse. Narrow, overgrown, with sections where the ground had slumped away entirely. In some places, I could see where a landslide had sheared off part of the slope years ago, and there were no recent signs of use. I had to bushwhack in short bursts and constantly check my map to make sure I wasn't drifting off course. By noon, I reached a small saddle that gave me a clear view of Murphy Ridge. It was jagged and steep, covered in dark pines with occasional bare rock faces. There was no sign of civilization in any direction. That view should have made me feel powerful, alone in the wild. But instead, I felt something else, like I was a long way from anything that could help me if something went wrong. Still, I pushed forward. My plan was to reach the ridge, descend into a small basin marked on the map, and spend the night there before looping back on a lower trail. If that trail even existed anymore. That's the risk I took with these half-forgotten routes. I liked the mystery, the uncertainty, but in hindsight, I don't think I respected how easily things could unravel. Around 3 p.m., I slipped. The trail ran along a narrow ledge with loose gravel and a steep drop to the left. I had been moving slow, using my poles for balance, when the ground gave way beneath my right foot. I fell sideways, bounced off a rock, and rolled down the slope, maybe 30 or 40 feet. My backpack absorbed some of the impact, but I landed hard on my side and slid into a clump of brush that finally stopped me. I lay there for a long time, stunned, breathing hard, trying to figure out if anything was broken. When I finally moved, my ribs flared with pain, and my right ankle felt wrong. Not broken, but badly twisted. I couldn't stand on it without sharp, shooting pain. My left elbow was scraped raw, and my head throbbed from where it had clipped something during the fall. But I was alive. I didn't hit my spine, and I hadn't passed out. It took over an hour to crawl back up to the trail. I moved slowly, dragging my pack behind me, grabbing at roots and rocks. When I finally reached the ledge again, I collapsed and lay there for a while, sweating, shaking, the sun beating down on me. The problem was I couldn't keep hiking like this. My ankle was too messed up. I tried wrapping it with an elastic bandage from my first aid kit, but even then, I could only hobble a few feet at a time. Every step felt like glass in the joint. I knew I couldn't make the ridge or the basin. I had to turn back. I checked my phone. No signal, of course. I hadn't expected one. I had a GPS device, but no emergency beacon. I'd always thought I'd be fine without one. That was a mistake. I camped that night in a small clearing I had passed earlier, about a mile back. The pain in my ankle kept me awake most of the night. I couldn't get comfortable, and every time I turned, it flared again. Around midnight, I heard something moving in the trees. Not close, but distinct. It didn't sound like deer, more deliberate, heavier. Then it went quiet. I didn't sleep after that. The next day, I tried to hike out, but progress was slow. I had to use both trekking poles just to move, and every few minutes I had to stop and rest. I was sweating constantly and going through water faster than I liked. My filtration gear was good, but the dry season had shrunk most of the streams. By late afternoon, I realized I wasn't going to make it out that day. I was too far. I camped again, ate the last of my fresh food, still had some trail mix, dried fruit, and energy bars. Enough for another 2 days, maybe 3 if I rationed. That night, I heard the footsteps again, farther off this time, but I could tell it wasn't my imagination. Something was circling the camp, staying in the trees. I clicked off my headlamp and sat in silence, listening. It would move a bit, then stop, then again, always just out of sight. I stayed up most of the night, knife in hand, ears straining. Eventually, it went away, or I just couldn't hear it anymore. By morning, I was exhausted. I kept hiking, pushing myself to move, but I was slow, and I had to detour several times where the trail was too steep or washed out. I started getting dizzy when I stood too fast, probably dehydration. I found a trickle of water and filtered what I could, but it wasn't enough. That evening, I came to a small ravine I hadn't noticed on the way in. The trail dipped down into it, then back up the other side. I stood at the edge and stared at it for a long time. I didn't think I could make it across. Then I heard movement again. This time it was closer. Behind me, maybe 50 yards up the slope. I froze. Whatever it was, it had been following me. I could hear its weight shifting on the brush. I didn't see anything. I waited. Nothing. I moved forward. Then I heard a sharp crack, like something stepping on a thick branch. I turned fast, heart racing. Nothing there. But the sound had been real. I don't know if it was a person, a bear, a cougar. Couldn't tell. But I knew one thing. It was tracking me. And it had been for 2 nights. I forced myself down into the ravine and crawled up the other side. Took everything I had. My ankle was screaming. I bit down hard on my tongue just to stay focused. When I got to the top, I collapsed again, panting, shaking. That night, I didn't pitch my tent. I just lay under a tree and kept my headlamp off. I didn't sleep. I heard it again, circling, waiting. It never came into view, but it was there. By morning, I had maybe 2 liters of water left. 1 bar. My lips were cracked. My ankle was swollen, dark purple now. But I knew I was getting close. I recognized some of the terrain. Around noon, I saw the dry creek bed. I always thought I had a good handle on things, especially when it came to the outdoors. I'd been hiking for years, mostly in the mountains surrounding my home in southern Colorado. But one weekend, I decided to push myself. I was 28, had some decent experience, and had always wanted to tackle more difficult terrain. That weekend, I packed my bag with all the essentials: water, extra food, a map, a flashlight, and my phone, though I knew there'd be no service out there. I didn't think about the danger as much as I should have. The plan was simple enough: an overnight trip in the San Juan Mountains. I'd leave early on Saturday morning, take a trail I hadn't hiked before, spend the night at a small camping site I'd read about, and head back down on Sunday. The trail was known to be tough, but I was feeling confident. The morning I left, the air was crisp with the freshness of early spring. It was early enough that the sun hadn't fully warmed the mountain yet, and there was a slight chill to the wind. I drove out of the small town where I lived, passing fields and valleys until I reached the trailhead. The trail was less crowded than I expected, but I figured it was a good sign. Fewer people meant more solitude, and that was exactly what I was hoping for. The beginning of the trail was well maintained, with markers and signs posted every so often. The path wound through dense pine forests, the trees towering above me, their needles brushing against each other in the breeze. The smell of pine was thick in the air, and the ground beneath my boots was soft, giving slightly with every step. I remember thinking how peaceful it was. Birds sang from above, and the distant sound of a creek flowed below. It was easy to forget that the wilderness was also a place where things could go wrong. I started gaining altitude quickly, and the path narrowed. As I moved farther from the trailhead, the trees became sparser, and the ground underfoot was more uneven. I wasn't surprised. This was a difficult trail. I had expected it to get more rugged as I went. By noon, I had reached the halfway point. The sun had risen higher in the sky, and the warmth of it began to ease the chill from my bones. I stopped for a break, drank some water, and ate a small snack. It was quiet, too quiet. The usual buzz of insects had died down, and the birds had stopped singing. I noticed how still the air had become. It wasn't entirely unusual for a mountain to have sudden lulls in the wind, but something about this felt off. I shook off the feeling and pressed on. The further I went, the more remote the trail became. The path was barely visible at times, just a narrow line cut through the wild brush and rocks. I had to be careful with my footing, and there were several moments where I had to climb over large boulders or carefully slide down steep drops. It was getting more challenging, but I was prepared for it. I had the skills, or at least I thought I did. Around mid-afternoon, I found myself at the base of a steep incline. The map said this was where the trail would split, but there was nothing, no sign, no marker, nothing to indicate that I was on the right track. The path I had been following seemed to disappear into thick brush and rocks. I stood there for a few moments, debating whether to push forward or turn back. There wasn't much signal on my phone to check anything, but I was pretty sure that if I turned back now, I would have wasted too much time. So I pushed on. The incline was steep and covered with loose gravel, making it treacherous to climb. Each step felt like it could be my last, but I took my time. The wind had picked up by then, and the weather was starting to change. The sky, once clear and bright, had turned a pale gray, and the clouds seemed to be rolling in faster than they should have. I glanced at my watch. It was still early afternoon, but it felt like time was speeding up. About 30 minutes into climbing, the storm hit. I'd been in storms before. I knew how to find shelter and wait it out, but this was different. The wind suddenly whipped through the trees, bending them at strange angles, and the first raindrops hit the ground, quickly turning to a steady downpour. Visibility dropped dramatically, and I had to slow my pace. The rocks beneath my boots became slick, and I lost my footing more than once, catching myself just before I could fall. I began to panic. It wasn't the kind of panic where I was certain I was in danger, but more of a creeping, nagging feeling that something was wrong. It was as if I could sense the weather growing more dangerous, more unpredictable. I knew I had to find shelter, but there was no clearing, no place to hide from the storm. The only thing I could do was keep moving up the mountain, hoping that the trail would somehow become clearer. As I climbed higher, the weather worsened. The temperature dropped, and the wind became so violent that I could barely stand up straight. The rain turned to hail, sharp little stones of ice hitting my face and arms. I pulled my hood over my head and tightened the straps on my backpack, but nothing could stop the feeling of helplessness that was creeping into me. I pushed forward for what felt like hours, but in reality, it was probably only 30 minutes. The trail had disappeared completely, leaving me scrambling through the rocks and brush. There was no sign of a campsite, no indication that anyone had been up here before. It was just me and the mountain was angry. Then I saw it. Through the haze of rain and hail, I made out a figure in the distance. Person. I wasn't sure if I was seeing things, but I blinked and squinted, and there it was again. A figure standing at the top of the ridge, staring down at me. My heart skipped a beat. I froze. For a moment, everything stopped. The storm, the wind, the rain, they all seemed to fade into the background. The only thing that existed was that figure. My first instinct was to call out to them, but I remembered how pointless it would be. The wind was too loud and they were too far away. Plus, I wasn't even sure if they were real. I didn't wait to find out. I turned around and started scrambling back down the trail, my heart pounding in my chest. The storm only seemed to worsen, the wind growing stronger with every step. I was losing my grip on reality. It wasn't just the weather that was making me uneasy now. There was something else in the air, something that I couldn't explain. I made it down the mountain, slipping and stumbling my way through the rocks. The world around me was a blur of rain and wind. My legs burned, and my chest felt tight as if the mountain itself were pressing down on me. But I didn't stop, couldn't. After what felt like hours, I finally stumbled into a small clearing. It wasn't much, but it was shelter, at least for now. I ducked behind a large boulder, out of the worst of the wind, and tried to catch my breath. I pulled out my phone and checked the map again, hoping to find a way to get back to the trailhead, but the map was useless in the storm. I was completely disoriented, unsure of where I was, but I knew one thing. I needed to get out of there. The feeling of being watched, the figure on the ridge, it wasn't something I could shake. I needed to get back to the safety of the trailhead, no matter how far away it felt. I gathered my strength and pushed through the storm, using the last of my energy to make my way back. By the time the storm finally broke, I was miles away from where I had started. The rain had stopped, and the clouds were breaking up, revealing a weak, late afternoon sun. The trailhead was still hours away, but the worst of the storm had passed. Eventually, I made it back to my car. I didn't even stop to rest. I didn't want to think about what had happened, about the figure I had seen or the unease I had felt. I just wanted to get home. I never did find out what that figure was, and part of me is glad for that. I've hiked those mountains many times since, but that day will always stick with me. The mountains are beautiful, but they can also be unforgiving. And sometimes, it's better to listen to that feeling in your gut that tells you something isn't right. That was the last time I hiked alone. I had been planning this hike for months, no years. The idea of trekking through the Cascade Mountains had always been a dream of mine. The untouched forests, the jagged cliffs, and the overwhelming silence were things I'd only ever experienced in pictures. But now it was all real. Everything I had imagined was going to become my reality for a few days. Alone, with nothing but my pack, a map, and the endless sky above me. It was the early summer of 2023, and I was in my late 20s. I had been in decent shape for the last few months, jogging and doing light weights at the gym to get myself prepared. I wanted to be in peak physical condition for the trail ahead. The hike was supposed to be challenging but manageable, about a 50-mile loop through the rugged part of the Cascades. At least that's what the guidebooks told me. To come alone. The kind of person I was meant I didn't mind solitude. I preferred it. My friends and family would often ask why I didn't go with a group, but I didn't have the same desire to share such moments with others. I wanted to prove something to myself, to see if I could make it out there alone, in the wild. The first day went off without a hitch. The sun was still shining as I set up camp in a small clearing just off the trail. I boiled some water for my dehydrated meals, ate in silence, and marveled at how peaceful it was. No traffic, no phones, no noise, just the sounds of the forest. I slept well that night, nestled in my tent, listening to the distant rustle of the wind through the trees. But things started to go wrong the next day. At first, it was small stuff, easy to brush off. The trail started to feel a bit less defined. It wasn't unusual for mountain trails to be a little vague in parts, but this felt different. The markers were few and far between, and I had to rely on my map more than I expected. At one point, I had to climb over a fallen tree that completely blocked the path, leaving me to scramble in the underbrush to find the continuation of the trail. That wasn't too bad, though. It wasn't until the afternoon that I started to feel uneasy. It was a creeping sensation at first, barely noticeable. Something about the landscape started to feel unfamiliar. The trees seemed denser than before, the shadows longer. I brushed it off as my mind playing tricks on me. After all, I'd only been on the trail for a day and a half. It wasn't possible to get lost yet, right? But by mid-afternoon, I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker in hours. I stopped, scanned the area, and pulled out my map. The path I had been following should have taken me to a small lake where I was supposed to set up camp for the night. But there was nothing that looked familiar. The landscape was all wrong. The ridgelines I was expecting to see were nowhere in sight. The map seemed to show a completely different area from where I stood. I began to feel the first real pangs of panic. At that point, I tried to stay calm. I knew that getting worked up would make things worse. I went over my options. Backtrack? No, I wasn't going to retrace my steps. I had a sense of where I'd been, but it felt like the more I thought about it, the more confused I became. The trail was supposed to be marked, yet here I was, lost and unsure of which direction to go. I checked my compass. That's when I realized I'd been moving east, but according to the map, the trail should have been leading me north. Somehow, I had veered off course without even realizing it. It was getting late. The sun had begun to dip lower in the sky, casting the forest in an eerie twilight glow. I didn't want to be stuck out here in the dark. I figured I'd try to find higher ground so I could get a better view of my surroundings. Maybe I could spot a trail or a landmark. So, I started hiking up a steep slope to my right. The going was tough, my legs burning as I pushed myself upward, the weight of my pack dragging me down with each step. By the time I reached the top, the sun was almost gone. The mountain ridges stretched far out ahead of me, but there was nothing familiar in sight. I was standing at the edge of a cliff with nothing but forest and rock below. The darkening sky had begun to send a chill into the air, and my sense of isolation grew. I sat down to think. I had food and water, but I was running low. I'd been counting on reaching that lake, where I'd planned to rest and refill my water bottles, but now that seemed impossible. I would have to find shelter for the night, though I had no idea where. I felt the weight of it all. The overwhelming silence, the cold creeping in, the growing fear that I wasn't as prepared as I had thought. My phone had no service, of course, but I hadn't expected it to work out here. I wasn't sure if I'd made a wrong turn earlier or if I was simply off the trail because I hadn't been paying enough attention. Either way, I was lost, and the consequences of that were beginning to sink in. As the sky darkened, I decided to make camp. I couldn't afford to keep hiking blindly through the night. I set up my tent, hoping I'd be able to find the right path in the morning. But as the hours passed, I lay awake, staring at the roof of my tent. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees, the only thing I could hear. It wasn't until the next day, with no clearer sense of direction, that things took a turn for the worse. I was 32 years old when I decided to go on a solo hiking trip through the Cascades. The mountains in Washington state had always intrigued me. They were far enough from civilization that you could lose yourself, but not so remote that they were dangerous, or at least that's what I thought. It was the end of September, and the weather was still mild. I had taken a week off from work, not really planning much, but something about the idea of getting away from it all, of hiking and being alone in the woods, appealed to me. I'd done some hiking in the past, mostly local trails, but this would be the longest I'd attempted by myself. I packed my gear carefully, making sure I had everything I'd need. A tent, a sleeping bag, a first aid kit, a small stove, food rations, and of course my map and compass. I didn't trust my phone out here, knowing how unreliable service could be. I didn't want to depend on something that could fail me in the middle of nowhere. My plan was to follow a trail that would lead me to a secluded campsite, about 12 miles into the mountains, and stay there for a couple of nights. The first day of hiking was peaceful. I made my way up the trail, admiring the towering trees around me and the occasional glimpse of wildlife. The trail wasn't overly steep, but it was challenging enough to make me feel like I was accomplishing something. By the time I reached the halfway point, I was feeling confident. I stopped for a rest, drank some water, and kept moving. It wasn't until late afternoon that I began to realize how far I had wandered from any kind of civilization. The trees grew thicker, and the sounds of the nearby streams became more distant. The trail was narrowing, and there was a noticeable lack of other hikers. The feeling was subtle at first, but it was there, the sensation of being watched. I couldn't shake it, even as I trudged forward, determined not to let my mind get the best of me. Around sunset, I found my campsite. It was a small clearing just off the trail, with a flat area perfect for pitching my tent. I set up quickly, trying not to think too much about how quiet it had become. There was no sound of birds, no rustling in the leaves, no wind at all, just silence. As night settled in, I cooked a simple meal over my stove, the warmth of the flame the only comfort against the cold creeping in. The sun was long gone, and the sky above was a blanket of stars. I ate quickly and crawled into my tent, the sounds of the forest eerily absent. I hadn't expected a lively symphony of nature at night, but this complete stillness, it didn't feel right. I lay there for what felt like hours, just staring at the inside of the tent, listening. Every now and then, I thought I heard something. A branch cracking in the distance, the rustle of leaves, but when I listened more closely, there was nothing. Eventually, I fell asleep, but it wasn't restful. My dreams were fragmented, filled with strange, unsettling images. When I woke up the next morning, I felt a strange sense of urgency, as if something wasn't quite right. The air felt heavier, and the forest seemed different, darker, more oppressive. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, the result of a poor night's sleep. I packed up my gear and decided to continue the hike, to push through whatever unease I was feeling. The trail ahead was supposed to be even more remote, which was exactly what I wanted. The second day of hiking was even more secluded. As I climbed higher into the mountains, the landscape began to change. The trail twisted and turned, taking me through narrow passes and across small streams. The trees were denser, their branches stretching over the path in a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. felt as though the world was closing in on me. I stopped for water and a quick snack around midday, but the feeling of being watched had returned. This time, it was stronger. I couldn't shake the sensation that someone, or something, was out there, hidden among the trees, just beyond my sight. I scanned the area around me, but saw nothing. No movement, no sounds, just the rustle of the wind through the leaves. I pressed on, telling myself it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid. But the feeling wouldn't go away. By the time I reached the next stretch of trail, I felt exhausted. The weight of my pack seemed to get heavier with each step. I knew I had to stop soon, but something inside me urged me to keep going. I needed to get to the campsite I had marked on my map, the one deep in the woods, far away from everyone else. It was late afternoon when I arrived at the next clearing. I was tired both physically and mentally. The exhaustion of the hike, combined with the constant nagging feeling of being watched, had taken its toll. I set up my tent quickly, trying to ignore the unease that had settled into my bones. That night, I barely slept at all. Every sound in the forest seemed magnified. I could hear something moving outside my tent, just beyond my reach, but when I peered out into the darkness, there was nothing there. I spent the entire night lying awake, listening to the silence, trying to convince myself it was just wildlife, maybe a deer or a bear, passing through. The next morning, I didn't waste any time packing up. I wanted to leave this place to get back to the main trail where I would feel safer. But as I was breaking down my tent, I noticed something strange: the tracks around my campsite. At first, I thought they were just animal tracks, but they didn't look right. They were too large and too deep for any animal I could think of. They circled around the camp, just outside the light of my tent, and then disappeared into the trees. That's when the fear hit me full force. I didn't know who or what had been near my campsite, but I knew I wasn't alone out here. I had to get back to civilization and fast. But the problem was, I was still 8 miles from the nearest trailhead, and the sun was already starting to dip low in the sky. I tried to stay calm, to reason through the situation, but the panic was beginning to set in. I started hiking back, keeping my eyes and ears open for any signs of movement. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming now. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the leaves, made my heart race. I kept moving, faster now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. The trail was long and winding, and I found myself looking over my shoulder more than once, convinced that I saw someone, or something, just out of the corner of my eye. Finally, after what felt like hours of walking, I reached the main trail. I had never been so relieved to see a well-trodden path. I knew I still had a couple of hours to hike before I would reach the trailhead, but at least I wasn't in that isolated part of the forest anymore. It wasn't until I reached the parking lot and saw my car, parked in the empty space, that I allowed myself to breathe again. I was safe. I had made it. But as I drove home, I kept replaying the events in my mind, trying to make sense of everything. The tracks around my campsite, the feeling of being watched, the eerie silence of the forest. I still don't know what happened out there, but I do know one thing. I'll never go back to those mountains again. Some things are better left unexplored. I was 32 the year I decided to do a solo hiking trip through the canyons of southern Utah. It was 2017, early May, and the weather was warm but not unbearable yet. I had planned the trip for months. I lived in Billings, Montana back then, and I was working a remote IT job, so I had the flexibility to disappear into nature for a couple of weeks. I needed it. I was going through a rough patch. Nothing dramatic, just the usual stuff. Stress, burnout, no real connection to anyone. I figured the silence would do me good. The place I chose was a narrow, lesser-known canyon system near Escalante, not one of the tourist-heavy areas. I had researched it in blogs, watched YouTube videos, marked up digital maps, saved coordinates. My plan was to start from a dirt road trailhead that barely showed up on maps, hike in with 4 days worth of food and water, sleep in the canyon for 2 nights, and then loop back. The trail was unmarked, and most of the route was dry riverbed weaving through tight sandstone walls. I drove down from Montana over 2 days. Slept in my car the night before starting the hike. The rental SUV I had was packed with extra water, backup food, a Garmin satellite GPS, a cheap emergency beacon I'd never tested, and the usual survival gear. I thought I was being smart. I started the hike early in the morning. The air was cool, crisp. My backpack was heavy, but manageable. I carried about 7 liters of water, a small tent, sleeping bag, cooking stuff, and a filter straw for emergencies. The canyon walls weren't towering at first, more like gentle sandstone rises. A few scrubby trees here and there. Lizards darted between the rocks. I saw rabbit tracks and what looked like coyote scat. After a couple of miles, the path narrowed and dropped down into a deeper gulch. The walls rose on either side, orange and smooth. The silence was the thing that stood out. No planes overhead, no wind, just the sound of my boots shifting gravel. I hiked all day, stopping now and then to drink and eat trail mix. I didn't see another soul. That was expected. This area was isolated. The only thing close was an old cattle road about 10 miles to the west. No signal. The GPS kept tracking my breadcrumb trail as I moved deeper in. The first night, I set up camp under a slight overhang in the canyon wall. The sky above was clear, no clouds at all. I heated up a pouch of chili, drank water, and sat there watching the last light fade off the rocks. I felt good. Tired, sore, but good. The next day, I followed the main wash deeper into the system. The walls were taller now, maybe 80 or 90 feet. Smooth like glass in some parts, carved by centuries of water. There were small potholes in the sandstone, some filled with murky water. I saw insects, some frogs, even a dead rabbit floating in one. Around noon, I felt the air shift a little. Hard to explain, just heavier. Still no clouds. I checked my weather app, no signal. Of course, I had downloaded a forecast the day before. Clear skies. No rain for 3 days. But something felt off. I pressed on. The trail got tighter, and in places, I had to sidestep through slot canyons barely wider than my shoulders. I scraped my pack on the rocks trying to squeeze through. At one point, I had to lower myself into a 4-foot drop using my elbows and knees. The walls pressed in like I was walking inside a stone throat. Around 4 p.m., I came into a wider bowl, an open area maybe the size of a basketball court. The wash was dry as bone, just a bed of sand and stone. I dropped my pack and rested in the shade. Ate a protein bar. Drank more water. That's when I heard it. A sound I couldn't place at first, like distant wind or not quite wind. A low, continuous roar. It lasted about 5 seconds, then stopped. I sat still. Then I heard it again, deeper this time. A vibration, then silence. I stood up, looked back the way I'd come. Nothing. I climbed a boulder to get a better view down the canyon corridor behind me. Still nothing. I don't know why I felt uneasy. Something in my gut turned. I decided to move. I strapped my pack and started up the trail again, this time picking up my pace. I had maybe 2 hours before sundown, and I wanted to make it to a spot I had marked on my GPS. A high ledge with flat ground and a good view. As I walked, the noise returned, louder now, more constant. I turned around and froze. Around the bend, a wall of water appeared. Brown, churning, violent. A flash flood. I didn't think. I ran. I sprinted as fast as I could, the pack slamming my back. My boots slipped on gravel. I made it maybe 30 yards before I realized I wouldn't outrun it. The walls on either side were too steep to climb. I veered toward a wedge in the rock wall, a small alcove 5 feet above the wash. I threw my pack up first, then scrambled up, scraping my shins bloody. Seconds later, the water hit. A brown wave rushed past, smashing debris, rocks, branches. The sound was thunder. It shook the canyon. I pressed myself into the alcove, heart pounding. The water was 2, maybe 3 feet deep, but fast, like a freight train. Logs floated by. A backpack, someone else's, tumbled past, half sunk. The roar didn't stop. It went on for hours. The sun vanished behind the canyon walls, and I was left in shadow. I sat there, pressed into stone, legs curled up. The smell of wet mud and rotting wood filled the air. Eventually, the water stopped rising. It stayed at a steady level. I knew flash floods could last minutes or hours. This one went on long into the night. Couldn't sleep. The cold crept in. I had no blanket, no jacket, just what I wore. I couldn't reach my pack. It had fallen off the ledge during the scramble and now sat in the middle of the wash, soaked. By morning, the water had slowed but didn't vanish. The wash was now a creek. Brown water moved slowly, quietly, like it was pretending it hadn't tried to kill me the night before. I had no way forward or back. The narrow slots I'd come through were underwater. I sat there for hours trying to think. I had half a protein bar in my pocket, soggy and wrapped in lint. I ate it. I still had my GPS in my pants pocket, surprisingly dry. It had a single SOS feature, but I had never used it. I pressed it. The light blinked red. I waited. I had no idea if the signal went through. No idea if anyone was coming. The batteries on the GPS were at 46%. I turned it off to save juice. I decided I couldn't wait in the alcove forever. I climbed down when the water level dropped to about knee height. My boots squelched with every step. I waded over to my soaked backpack. Everything inside was wet. The sleeping bag was ruined. The tent was gone. Food was mush. I wrung out what I could and stuffed it all back inside. I had to move. Staying put meant no food, no warmth, and the chance the water might rise again. I followed the wash downstream, slowly, carefully. Each step was slippery. My legs were weak. The walls still pressed in tight, and in places I had to swim. My boots dragged me down. I took them off, tied the laces, and slung them over my neck. The canyon opened up after a mile. Wider, shallower. I saw sunlight again. I climbed a rise on the right and reached a dry shelf. I collapsed there, shaking, and let myself sleep for maybe an hour. When I woke, the sun was straight above me. I walked until sunset. No sign of help. No people. The GPS still blinked red. But I didn't know what that meant. That night, I found a small cave under a ledge and curled up inside, using my wet jacket as a pillow. I was cold, very cold. My muscles ached from the previous day. My stomach hurt. The next day, I hiked west, aiming for the cattle road I had marked on my GPS during planning. It was over 10 miles away, but the terrain was harsh, uneven, broken by gullies and dried creek beds. I barely had the strength. By the end of that day, my legs were cramping. I had a fever. I was drinking from muddy puddles using the filter straw. At one point, I vomited from something I ate. I don't know what. Maybe I'd swallowed some dirty water. Day 4, I climbed a sandstone ridge and saw the cattle road. A faint line in the desert. Could have cried. I walked all day toward it. I reached it by sunset and collapsed on the shoulder. I woke up to the sound of tires on gravel. Pickup truck pulled up. I was too weak to stand. The man who found me didn't ask questions. He helped me into the truck and gave me water. I sat in silence the whole ride to town. At the clinic in Escalante, they said I had mild hypothermia, dehydration, and early-stage kidney strain from the water loss. They kept me overnight. 3 days later, I flew home. I never went hiking alone again. I kept that GPS unit in a drawer and never used it again. I still have it. That flood wasn't in the forecast. Later, I found out a thunderstorm had hit